June 23, 1942. A gray afternoon over West Wales, low cloud and a wind that carries the smell of sea salt. From the sky, a silhouette drops out of the clouds. A sharp, broad-shouldered fighter, darker than the typical Luftwaffe silhouettes British pilots had come to dread. It turns, lines precise, and begins to ease toward Pembry Airfield. For a few seconds, the field's controllers assume the worst, another attack. For a few more seconds, the pilot inside is equally perplexed. He taxes in among Spitfires as if onto friendly ground. What followed over the next 48 hours would change how Allied pilots fought the Luftwaffe. Not because of some single technological miracle, but because an intact, highly advanced enemy aircraft fell into Allied hands, and the knowledge gleaned from it was shared, tested, and incorporated into American fighter doctrine. The question posed in the title, "What happened when a German pilot shared his secret fighter with America?" isn't rhetorical. It is a story of mistake, intelligence, engineering, and the small human moments that tilt strategy. The man in the cockpit was Oberleutnant Armin Faber. He had come down through cloud, disoriented. Sun, wind, a map of shifting bearings. He had not intended to land on RAF soil. Yet, there he was, among mechanics and officers, a single pilot with an aircraft that for months had seemed to appear from nowhere in fights over the Channel and the French coast, leaving British squadrons battered and puzzled. The plane was a Focke-Wulf FW-190. To pilots on the receiving end, it had a reputation. Fast off the mark, brutally responsive in roll, armed with clusters of cannons that could shred a fighter with a single pass. Radio reports and eyewitness accounts from late 1941 into 1942 told of Spitfires and Hurricanes suddenly outperformed, of German pilots who could dictate the terms of an engagement. The RAF had been forced to adjust tactics by trial and costly error. Losses mounted, and there was a growing sense, admiration mixed with alarm, that the FW-190 represented a significant leap in fighter design. That reputation made what happened at Pembry a windfall. The aircraft was captured more or less intact. Ground crews secured the pilot and examined the plane on the spot. The urgency was palpable. Move it, preserve it, learn from it. Within days, the FW-190 was packed and shipped to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough, a place where Allied engineers and test pilots would peel the machine apart, literally and figuratively, to understand why it had been so lethal at short ranges and so difficult to beat. To appreciate what Farnborough would soon discover, it helps to look at what made the FW-190 different on first encounter. At its core was the BMW 801 radial engine. A radial engine is arranged like a circle of cylinders around a central crankshaft, compact, robust, and capable of delivering high power without the long, narrow profile of an inline engine. The BMW 801 produced an impressive horsepower package for its size and gave the FW-190 immediate acceleration and a top end that made it unforgiving in a dive. The Merlin engine, familiar to British pilots in Spitfires and Hurricanes, was an inline design with different characteristics. On paper, and especially in certain flight regimes, the BMW 801 translated into tactical dominance. Another defining trait was roll rate, the speed at which a plane can rotate around its longitudinal axis. The FW-190's ailerons and wing design produced a roll rate that allowed quick, violent changes in bank angle. Ailerons are the hinged control surfaces on the trailing edge of a wing that make the aircraft roll. Think of them as the steering wheel for banking. A fast roll rate meant the FW-190 could present guns and then snap its nose away before an opponent could get a bead on it. Combined with concentrated armament, often multiple cannons mounted close to the fuselage so fire could be focused, the effect in short-range skirmishes was devastating. There was also its dive performance. Aerodynamically stable and powered by the BMW, the FW-190 could dive at high speeds without flutter or structural failure in conditions that made contemporaries hesitate. But those strengths came with engineering trade-offs, frontier conditions where the aircraft's advantages diminished. At Farnborough, engineers and pilots dismantled that myth of invincibility in careful, clinical stages. Captain Eric Brown, the Royal Navy's most celebrated test pilot, would later fly the captured FW-190. His notes and recollections read like an anatomy lesson. Up close, the BMW 801 revealed its own constraints. The engine's cooling system and supercharger configuration meant the plane's performance dropped at higher altitudes. Above roughly 20,000 feet, the advantage the FW-190 enjoyed at lower levels began to evaporate. For an aircraft optimized for low and medium altitude combat, that was a critical limit. Testing also exposed a troubling handling characteristic at high speeds. Beyond approximately 400 miles per hour, especially during high-speed pullouts from a dive, the FW-190's control surfaces became extremely heavy. Pilots could find themselves in a dangerous window. After diving where they had the advantage, the effort required to recover could be punishing, slowing response and increasing the risk of overshooting or losing situational awareness. In plain terms, the aircraft's power encouraged high-speed attacks, but those attacks left narrow margins for safe recovery if the opponent executed a timely counter. Farnborough's autopsy was methodical. Guns were removed, instruments cataloged, engine components tested under load. The combination of superior roll rate and concentrated firepower explained why Allied pilots had been losing the short snap engagements. But the altitude and high speed limitations suggested openings, tactical levers that could be pulled if pilots knew where they were. That knowledge did not stay in Britain. The captured aircraft and the detailed flight reports from Brown and other test pilots were shared. Allied intelligence is not a monolith, it is a network, and in this case, the British chain of analysis connected directly to American eyes and ears. In the summer months following the Farnborough work, American test pilots and officers were invited to inspect and fly the FW-190. Major Cass Hoove was among those Americans who flew and documented the aircraft. His reports distilled observations into practical recommendations. Engage the FW-190 where its engine and supercharger were least effective. Bring fights to higher altitudes. Avoid allowing the German fighter to exploit its superior roll rate in low-level snap attacks. The practical implications for U.S. fighters, primarily the P-47 Thunderbolt and later the P-51 Mustang, were immediate and doctrinal. The P-47, with its rugged radial engine and strong high-altitude performance when properly supercharged, could hold altitude and meet the FW-190 on equal thermal ground. The P-51, with its excellent high-altitude performance, could escort bombers over long ranges and keep engagements above the threshold where the FW-190 excelled. American commanders emphasized altitude in planning. Fighters would seek to force encounters above 25,000 feet, where the German fighter's engine and cooling systems yielded diminishing returns. Those tactical shifts were not the product of one report or one flight alone. They were the sum of Farnborough's tests, British analysis, American flight impressions, and the distribution of operational bulletins and training films that explained the FW-190's envelopes and vulnerabilities. Still, the chain is clear. A captured aircraft, examined carefully and allowed to be flown by Allied pilots, fed information into American units. That is the factual core behind the formulation that America was, in effect, shared the German fighter. What did American pilots do differently when they incorporated this knowledge? For one, they altered how they positioned themselves on bomber escort missions. Rather than remaining at the cruised altitudes where earlier engagements had favored the Germans, escorts were trained to climb and hold the advantage, forcing the enemy to climb into air that reduced the FW-190's power and responsiveness. Training emphasized energy management. Avoid being baited into low-level dogfights where the FW-190's role and firepower could be decisive, and instead use the Mustang's long-range speed and the Thunderbolt's diving and high-altitude capabilities to control the fight. There were also subtler tactical habits passed on. How to respond to a snap-roll attack, where to aim when facing concentrated cannon fire, how to utilize coordinated tactics so a flight would not be singled out and punished. Major Hoove's reports translated the technical discoveries into plain language for squadrons, aimed to engage on terms that minimized the FW-190's advantages and maximized its exposure to its own weaknesses. On the engineering side, the captured FW-190 informed design conversations. Concentrating armament close to the fuselage to focus weight and increase lethality was noted. So were the control surface balances that produced quick roll. For American designers and armament officers, the FW-190 was part cautionary tale and part inspiration. Lessons on how to manage control forces at high speed, how to balance firepower against handling, and what to avoid in supercharger and cooling design for sustained high-altitude performance. How much did these lessons change the course of the air war? It is important to resist a simplistic narrative that credits a single aircraft with turning the tide. The intelligence gained at Farnborough and disseminated to American units contributed significantly to a broader set of adjustments: improved tactics, better pilot training, and the steady arrival of capable Allied fighters. Over months, as these shifts compounded, Allied kill ratios improved and the balance in certain theaters began to tilt. German pilots like Oberleutnant Josef Pips, whose name appears in contemporary accounts, acknowledged in one form or another that British and American pilots were adapting, that their early advantage was being contested on new terms. The capture of the FW-190 was a pivotal link in a chain of many events, not the sole cause, but an instrument of change that allowed other factors to operate more effectively. We should return for a moment to the scene of the capture itself, the human element that made all this possible. Oberleutnant Armin Faber, confused and exhausted, stepped down from a machine his colleagues had used to dominate dogfights. He became a prisoner and, according to available accounts, was eventually sent to a POW facility in Canada. He survived the war and returned to Germany. There is no evidence in the record to suggest treason or intent beyond disorientation. To cast the landing as deliberate would be to import motive where the facts don't support it. The irony is stark. A single navigational error by a single pilot handed his foes the material evidence to decode a weapon that had been giving them trouble. Farnborough's work, Captain Eric Brown's flights, Major Cass Hoove's reports, and the subsequent distribution of those lessons to American units created a feedback loop that turned technology into usable intelligence. The Allies did not merely possess a captured machine, they translated its physical reality into operational doctrine. That process, observation, testing, translation into tactics, and dissemination, is the quieter side of technological war-making. It is rarely dramatic, but it is decisive. There is also a broader engineering point in this episode. Technological advantage is contextual. The FW-190 excelled in a specific envelope: low to medium altitude, high-speed skirmishes where rapid roll and concentrated guns could dominate. Outside those conditions, or when pilots were trained to deny them that envelope, the advantage shrank. Machines do not exist in a vacuum. They operate within atmospheres, against human opponents, under logistic and environmental constraints. Intelligence, knowing where a machine performs best and where it is vulnerable, can turn apparent superiority into manageable, if still dangerous, performance. For commanders and designers on both sides, the lessons were enduring. The Allies learned to look for trade-offs in enemy systems and to exploit them through doctrine. Designers were reminded that a plane that excels at one task may suffer in another, and that the human-machine interface, how control forces change with speed, how cooling systems respond to altitude, matters as much as raw horsepower. For the average pilot in 1943, the lesson was simpler but life-saving. Climb when possible, avoid low-level snap fights, and trust the tactics born of testing rather than hope that brute force alone would win an encounter. By late 1943, kill ratios and pilot reports reflected a different balance in the skies. The Germans continued to field capable aircraft and pilots, and they adapted in turn. But the Pembry incident had cracked the code of the FW-190. What had seemed like secret supremacy was cataloged, measured, and explained. The machine that had been a mystery became an answer book. This story holds a quiet moral. Intelligence can erode technological advantage as effectively as new machines can create it. The capture of the FW-190 was not an act of espionage in the cinematic sense. It was an accident with strategic consequences. It reminds us that in war, chance events, when coupled with methodical analysis and a willingness to share and apply knowledge, can reshape operations. One last note on the human figures who made this knowledge usable. Captain Eric Brown translated performance into pilot experience, how the plane felt, how it handled at extremes, while Major Cass Hoove and his American colleagues translated those impressions into actionable doctrine. The chain ran from a confused pilot on a Welsh runway to flight manuals and training reels used by squadrons crossing the Channel months later. That relay is what legitimizes the title's framing. The German fighter did, in effect, get shared with America. First seized by the RAF, then studied and flown at Farnborough, then passed into American hands and American tactics. It was unintended, but it was real. So, what is the final tally? A single pilot's navigational error did not win the war, and the captured FW-190 did not magically erase German air power. But the incident provided a crucial piece of the intelligence puzzle. It explained why the FW-190 had been so effective and where to fight it. Allied pilots, now armed with that understanding, adjusted their tactics. Aircraft design conversations shifted in light of those observations. Over time, these changes contributed to the Allies' ability to contest and then dominate the air over Northwest Europe. There is a lesson in the quiet aftermath. Know your enemy's limits, teach those limits to your pilots, and then force engagements where their strengths matter least. In the case of the FW-190, the chain from Pembry to Farnborough to American squadrons is a textbook example of how the capture of hardware can become the capture of understanding, a transfer of knowledge as consequential as any convoy of weapons. If this episode raised questions for you about the pilots involved, the technical numbers, or how doctrine was changed, tell us where you're watching from and drop a comment. It helps guide what deep dives we make next. Armin Faber returned to Germany after the war. The plane he landed at Pembry lived on in reports, test notes, and the trained instincts of Allied pilots. The episode is an enduring case study. A technological edge can be neutralized by intelligence, and a single human mistake can have effects far beyond one man's career. In the end, the most important battlefield instrument is the mind that can read a machine and teach others how to defeat it. If you want a deeper technical breakdown, the full specs of radial versus inline engines, or a flight-by-flight comparison of Captain Brown's notes and Major Hoove's operational directives, check the playlist linked at the end and the sources in the description. Subscribe for more detailed episodes on wartime technologies and the intelligence work that decoded them.